while we're doing the show. He's sort of volunteered his services. He's always sort of standing by. So if there's anything that, we need to double check or check, we can sort of just mention it and it'll get checked and it'll pop up on my screen a couple minutes later. So
Oh, cool.
feel
Okay.
free to take advantage of that.
Okay, cool.
And yeah, I think we're all good. I think we're streaming. Yeah, we're good. That's it. We're live. Always a little amazing.
Good stuff.
That we can just go live with the laptop. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, just got to do a quick. All right, this has been in the works for a couple months, so we're super excited to have Rizwan Virk with us. He currently runs Bayview Labs and Play Labs at MIT, and he's a video game industry pioneer, an independent film producer, and author. His latest book, which was fantastic, is The Simulation Hypothesis, something that we talk about a lot here, and it's an MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics all agree that we are in a video game. So welcome to the show, Rizwan. How's it going?
Thanks for having me on. I'm doing okay. How about yourself?
Yeah, we're okay today. Darren's learning how to hack the simulation, so we want to talk about that for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, it's less that I'm learning how to hack it, and I think I got some reaffirmations this last week that made me think that the path I've been trying to take to maybe influence it, I won't say hack it, it's more like subtly influence it, seem to be on the right path. So I'm curious to see what your thoughts are about that. I don't know if we want to jump right into the deep end of the pool right away like that.
Yeah, we can start in the shallow end.
Yeah, we should probably wade into that because, let's start in the shallow.
Right, because that's a complex topic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's one that I don't know. It's getting harder and harder to refute. So it's like, well, relativity is going down in popularity. Simulation is going up. So I mean, at what point are they going to be like equal?
So I guess
it's true.
I guess we could start with you've been interested in this for a long time since you met video games back in the 80s probably. But when did you decide to actually like write the book and get into this for the broader public?
Well, yeah, like you said, I've been interested in this for a while. I mean, even going back to when I was playing Atari video games, and I would see, like in the racing games, there would be a set of bleachers, and I'd always wonder, was there a virtual world, inside there beyond the bleachers? Were there actual virtual people there? I mean, the answer ended up being no for those Atari 8-bit video games. But then as, I started to play some of the MMORPGs, the 3D games in the 90s and 2000s, and particularly virtual worlds like Second Life, I started to get even more intrigued by this question of, is there a virtual world that exists when I'm not playing it? But probably the most direct experience that I had recently was a couple years ago. I think in 2016, I was playing a virtual reality game. And so, I had on the VR headset.
Yeah.
And it was a ping pong game, table tennis game. And I had the controller in my hand and I started to play. And the physics engine was so good that it felt like I was really playing ping pong. I mean, I had a paddle in my hand and there was an actual table and there was an opponent on the other side of the table. Now, the resolution wasn't even that great. I mean, if the opponent was just kind of a blocky figure, but it felt so realistic that at the end of the game, I totally forgot that I was in virtual reality and I felt like I was really playing ping pong. So I set the paddle down on the table and I leaned against the table. And of course, there was no table. So the controller fell to the floor and I almost fell over. And I realized that, we're getting to that point of immersion where, we may not be able to distinguish between physical reality and virtual reality. I mean, we're not quite there yet, but we'll get there. And so I started to think about what are some of the stages of technology that would be needed to get there. And that really led me, more directly to writing the book. I'd also been interested in a lot of paranormal and spiritual topics and had kind of delved into some of the Eastern traditions about how the world around us is Maya or illusion, which leads us to the question of what's beyond that. And so all of those ideas kind of came together really about a year ago when I wrote an article putting together some of my ideas, and it ended up being my most popular, blog post ever. So I then decided to go ahead and write a book and really flesh out these ideas.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm not much of a video gamer myself, but I do remember playing in the 80s as well. And I actually, it was SimCity that got me.
Video games in the 80s must have been.
Yeah, it was SimCity in the late 80s, early 90s that got me kind of addicted. And I was like, whoa, this is like, I'm staying up all night playing these simulation games. And then recently I did try on the VR mask as well, because my sister works at this Cloudhead Games. They're a VR developer on Vancouver Island. And it's a game it's kind of like a Goonies meets Myst, that game from the 90s or whatever. And you're fully immersed. Like you're on the beach, you're in all these different environments. Like you're almost like in a movie. And that's what made me realize like the potential of just being in this world. And now that like Facebook, I think, owns Oculus, like where are we going with this virtual world? Like, and then reading your book makes you think, soon there's millions or billions of people are going to be literally plugged into another world.
Right. It's kind of like, I don't know if you saw the movie Ready Player One, where, they had the Oasis, which was a virtual reality world, and everybody used it for everything from going to school to, fitness, sports, socializing, all these different things. And of course, those are still, with virtual reality glasses. So although it's very possible you'll forget that you're in a virtual world, at some point you'll be reminded because of the VR glasses. And, I had another experience where it was an early VR game where I was inside a cavern complex, and they had a crypt to the right and a huge fall. And I was afraid to move my leg to the right because I felt like I was going to actually fall into this crypt. Of course, there was no crypt. I was in a VR room. But the question then is, at what point do we no longer need the glasses? And at what point can we reproduce that experience? And this leads us to the most popular incarnation of this idea in science fiction, which is the Matrix, right? Because even people who haven't seen the movie, know the basic idea that Keanu Reeves is playing Neo. He's a hacker, and he's living his kind of droll existence life. And he comes across Morpheus, who's played by Lawrence Fishburne, who's named after the Greek god of dreams, who tells him, you have been living in a dream world. And I can't really tell you what the Matrix is. You have to be shown. And he gives him this choice of the red pill or the blue pill. And Keanu Reeves, Neo takes the red pill, and he wakes up inside a pod. So it was so fully immersive that he wasn't aware that he was living a virtual world. And so, in the book, I lay out 10 stages of development, video games and technology, that would get us to that point, which I call the simulation point, the point at which we can create something like the Matrix that is quite indistinguishable. And it's not just about the resolution. So it turns out our pixel resolution has gotten quite good.
Yeah.
Most movies you see today are digital movies, it's transmitted over digitally to the movie theater, and they project it at 2K resolution. Well, many screens now have 4K resolution, and pretty soon we're going to have 8K resolution. And if you've seen a movie like Blade Runner 2049 or The Avengers or the later Star Wars movies, the special effects blend in pretty well with the live action, and you sometimes can't tell the difference. That's because the pixel resolution is so good. But the problem with technology, from a technology perspective, is how do you render that in real time, right? And that's always been the problem with virtual reality is, if you have the glasses on and you move to the right or to the left, you have to actually render the pixels moving. And so that technology is getting better, but it's not quite there. You can't do that with photorealistic. And so in the book, I lay out the 10 stages of technology development. And, starting with text adventure games, which, takes us back to the 1970s with Adventure, and then the 80s with Zork. Then you have arcade games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, and those were the games that I grew up with. Then you have more role-playing games where you take on a character, which started off with like King's Quest as graphical adventures. But if you've ever played any of those games, what you'll notice is the character kind of walks across the screen, and he gets to the edge of the screen, and the screen shifts. And what's really happening is that the pixels are moving. So all of those pixels are already rendered. So all of the screens are basically pixels stored in memory, and the computer is just moving them. But if you ask somebody in the 80s, can you render a fully 3D world like World of Warcraft or Fortnite or Second Life or even The Sims Online, The answer would be no, there isn't enough computing power to render all of those pixels. But the real breakthrough came with 3D modeling, where you didn't have to render all the pixels. You just had to have the shapes of the objects and then textures. And then the rule of thumb was only render that which can be observed from your character. Right. And so that was kind of the big breakthrough that allowed us to do these 3D immersive virtual worlds, at least on a screen. And so that's a key, part of development. Virtual reality and augmented reality are like stages 4 and 5, but we're still using glasses. So if you remember, when Neo woke up outside the Matrix, he had an actual cable that was plugged into his neocortex, which is probably why they call him Neo. And they could swap out the simulation, right? They had the dojo, the martial arts dojo, and they had the scene where there were lots of people in gray and one woman in red who was a virtual character, or what we would call in the video game world an NPC, a non-player character, right? And so that area is called BCI, or brain computer interface. And so the question is, will we be able to beam scenes directly to the brain, and then will we be able to read your responses, just like when I was playing ping pong? Will we be able to read them directly from the brain and send them back to the cloud? And if we can do that, then we're well on our way to reaching this theoretical point. And then there's AI and having realistic NPCs like Agent Smith in the Matrix. And then finally, there's this idea of downloadable consciousness. And this is actually a very popular topic here in Silicon Valley, which is, can I download my consciousness onto a silicon device? There's people who think that you'll be able to do that within, 20 to 50 years. And that brings up all kinds of philosophical questions about what is consciousness and is that really possible or not. But in any case, my estimate is we'll get to the simulation point ourselves within 50 to 100 years. So let's say by 2100 or 2150, where we can produce something like the Matrix. And so the question that gets asked is, if we're going to be there in another 50 to 100 years, what would a civilization that has had computers for 1,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, what have they been able to produce? And so are we already inside some kind of a simulated world that was produced by one of these civilizations? And that's become to be known as the simulation hypothesis.
Which makes a lot of sense, because we're running a bunch of these things. We're running probably, I would guess hundreds of thousands of rudimentary simulations all around the world right now as we speak. And that number is probably only going to increase as we get closer to that point. So if you only have one base reality and you have 10 million virtual realities or simulations running, where all the parts of the simulation are programmed to be, at least think they're self-aware, then that's interesting. And
right, because if you just look at the statistics at that point, right, and suppose each of those 10 million worlds have a billion or a trillion beings within them. So there was a philosopher at Oxford named Nick Bostrom, and he wrote a paper in 2003 called "Are We Living in a Simulation?" And he made a statistical argument, which is sort of what we're talking about here, which is, he said that if you count up all the beings in those simulated worlds, and then you count up how many beings there are in base reality, there's more simulated beings than in base reality, assuming that some civilization gets to that point where they can do that, right? And we all think it's going to be possible very soon. So statistically speaking, if you are a being, you are more likely to be a simulated being than a purely biological being in base reality. That was his argument, and that's just one of the versions of the simulation hypothesis. I call that the NPC version, which says that all of those beings are basically simulated consciousness. Then there's the PC version, which is the player character version, which is more like the Matrix, where the people like Neo and Morpheus existed outside the Matrix as conscious beings. And in this case, they were biological beings, but then they also existed inside the Matrix, and they were doing a virtual character that they were role-playing inside the Matrix. And so that's more akin to our video games, and that's why I like the video game model, because it can accommodate both of those, both the player characters and the non-player characters, into one theoretical model.
It also seems like it seems like it would be, I don't know what the best way to say that is. in that model, that model, to me, the game theory, I don't know, that's probably not the correct use of the term, but that version of it seems to fit more with like Eastern philosophical traditions, where that ties into soul groups, that ties into reincarnate, all that stuff can sort of fit into that a little better than the NPC model, I think.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And that's why, sometimes some of the science people get upset with me and they're like, you wrote this book about the simulation hypothesis, which is about computation and science. And why did you dedicate like a whole third of the book to talking about, mystical traditions and reincarnation and karma? And I said, well, for me, that's the science is supposed to be the search for truth and what is really going on in the universe. And that was also the domain of religion, right? It was, most religions get founded because somebody peeked outside the simulation. They were able to see what was on the other side, and then they came back and they said, this is what I saw. Now, each religion has its own version of that, which I liken to the old story of the blind men who saw the elephant, or they felt the elephant, right? Each of them felt a different part of the elephant, so they said, this is a different kind of thing. One said it's like a snake, was the trunk. One said it's like a tree, which was the legs, and one said it's like a house, right? And so, if we take what the religions have been telling us and say, okay, let's step back from any particular religion and say, what are the patterns and what is it that they're all saying? And they're all saying that this physical reality around us is not the ultimate reality, that it's more like a training ground, and that whatever we do here is being watched. Okay, being watched by who? Now is where you start to get into the difference between the Western Judeo-Christian religious traditions versus the Eastern traditions. And in the Western traditions, it's more, angels are watching us and recording our deeds and our good deeds and our bad deeds, and you go to heaven or hell based upon that. In the Eastern traditions, you have this idea of multiple lives, that you come back and you play a different character in each life, and you have tasks that are based upon your karma from the previous life, right? And in this is where Buddhism and Hinduism differ a little bit. They both have this idea of reincarnation, and karma is what drives the reincarnation, right? So if you look at those, say, well, why do you have to have another life? It's because of your karma. And in Hinduism, there is an indestructible soul that goes through lives. And in Buddhism, they say, well, the reason you come back is because of your karma. So you're really more like a bag of karma, which is like a set of information about you, which is like your score in a video game. So, the more I thought about how video games work, we have quests and achievements, right? When we make video games, that's how we direct the user. You could think of a questing system that is a very complex questing system that says, you do X and you have to fulfill this quest with person Y. You may not have to do it in this gameplay session. You could do it in the next gameplay session when you're a new character. And so where does karma live? I'm a computer science guy, so I say, I like to look at this and say, how would it work? Right, getting apart from the question of does God exist or not, I'd say how does this whole thing work, right? And it made more sense to me that this stuff exists outside the rendered world on what we would consider like a cloud server, right? Obviously, it's a different kind of computation than what we're used to, but it lives outside the rendered world, just like our score in a video game or our inventory of things that we have to do. And so you can envision a pretty complex quest system where every quest unlocks a new quest. And so if you end up having a certain task and you accomplish it, like go find the map to the Goblin King, then go get the treasure, go kill an orc, right? If you do that in our video game of life, it creates more karma and more tasks that you have to follow up on. And so I found that the Eastern traditions, it actually fits very well into this idea of the simulation hypothesis. So they have a term in the Hindu Vedas, which are kind of the oldest known scriptures, of the Leela, which is like a grand play, like a stage play of life that we're all engaged in. Now, of course, back then they didn't necessarily have computers, but today we would say, what's an interactive multiplayer stage play? Well, it's like a video game, right? That's how we would describe it today, that we're all inside this world. So I found that the religious traditions fit pretty well.
Yeah, and like the Akashic records would be the cloud probably then.
That's right. So the Akashic record would be the place where this information is stored. Now, this is where it gets interesting because, people who claim to be able to access the Akashic records don't just access knowledge, they can see what actually happened. So, another reason I wrote the book was a couple of years ago, I was working on a startup here in Silicon Valley which was a virtual reality startup. And they would take a video game like League of Legends or World of Warcraft, which are like 3D worlds, but they're on a 2D screen. And they would record a scene for you. And then later you could replay that scene, but instead of watching it like on a video feed, you would actually put on a VR headset, and it's like you were on the actual battlefield, and like this guy is killing this guy.
Wow.
So you could see it from any place. You could be like it's what we called a virtual camera. You could put the virtual camera anywhere. And that reminded me a lot of the Akashic records, but also like people that have had near-death experiences.
Yeah.
So, a good friend of mine is a gentleman named Daniel Brinkley. He wrote a book called Saved by the Light. He was struck by lightning and had multiple near-death experiences. And one of the most interesting aspects of his experience is what he called the life review. He called it the panoramic life review. He said he saw every event that had ever happened in his life, but he saw it not from his perspective. He saw it from the perspective of the other person that he did stuff to. And so now he actually saw and felt, right? So we're at a different level than what we did. We were just showing you visually what it would look like if you were seeing it from the other person's point of view. In this case, you could feel what the other person was feeling. So, but it reminded me very much of this. And, even in the Western traditions, they have this idea of the book of life in Judaism and Christianity, where your deeds are recorded. And in Islam, which is part of that whole Abrahamic line of religions, they actually explicitly say you have these recording angels. One is writing down your good deeds and one is writing down your bad deeds. And then when you die and you go in front of God, you actually have to review those deeds. But you don't just see a list on a piece of paper. You see the impact of what you did on other people. Well, it sounded a lot like the life review, the panoramic life review. And I thought, as a computer scientist, how would that be implemented? Well, does it make sense to have, 14 billion angels, 2 for each of us? You would have AI or computer programs that are just recording this stuff as we go through, and that gets stored somewhere in the cloud database like the Akashic records, and that could be pulled up and viewed from any angle, from any person's angle. And that's where I think there's a real overlap from the simulation hypothesis with not just any particular religious tradition, but really with all the religious traditions. They all kind of fit pretty well in this idea.
Yeah, I was really glad that you didn't shy away from that in the book and you dedicated that much to it. I mean, because these scientists are poo-pooing you on one hand, yet the evidence shows that the evidence is it already shows, but it's going to be widely accepted. I'm pretty sure soon enough. I mean, materialism is kind of falling down anyways, and the NDE evidence, the OBE evidence, there's all kinds of evidence that consciousness is not created in the brain, that we are more like an antenna. So it's funny that there's still that pushback, although I don't think in like 2 or 5 years it's going to be this. I think people are going to realize that,
Well, I hope so, but they're very slow moving within academia, and it's a paradigm shift for them, which is odd because if you look at physics and science itself, they already are saying there is no material, right? The world. So, the more they look for this physical world, you open up molecules and it's mostly space. And then you open up the atom and it's like 99.999% empty space. And then you go to the nucleus of the atom and you say, okay, let's look inside these protons to the subatomic. And you say, where is this thing called matter? And it's like the Russian dolls. You just keep opening up the dolls and there's almost nothing there. And, eventually it gets to the point where it seems like it's just information. So even scientists are agreeing with that. There's a really famous physicist named John Wheeler, and he was one of the last living physicists to work with Einstein and many of the greats of quantum physics. And, he said, when he died, he wrote his autobiography, and he said that physics in his lifetime went through 3 phases. And in the first phase, it was everything is a particle, like a physical object, right? And that tied to Newtonian classical mechanics. And he said, then everything was a field. It was a field of probabilities. And that tied to quantum mechanics. And he said, by the end, he came to the conclusion that there was no actual field. It was just information. And that every particle was really a bit of 1 or a 0. And so he has this famous phrase that he coined called it from bit. And so the idea is a physical object, it actually comes from bits. So, now we're back to computer science. Now, I think, he passed away before we got to quantum computers, but in quantum computers, you have this idea of bits that can have multiple values, which ties to, quantum indeterminacy, which we can talk about in a minute. But, It was sort of getting to this idea that the physical universe is an information computation machine. But just getting back to what you were saying about OBEs, and they've done remote viewing exercises,
Yep.
and some of the statistics are pretty amazing that they had. Like right here in Silicon Valley at Stanford Research Institute, while they were inventing the internet, and they were ARPANET, which was a predecessor, guys like Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff and others were also experimenting with remote viewing experiments with guys like Ingo Swann and others as their test subjects. So this is even here when I talk to technologists, they're not aware of this, but there's a real a convergence of these ideas, and remote viewing where you're just seeing another place. Again, you can model that very easily and say, how would that work? Well, you can place a virtual camera anywhere in the 3D video game world. And so that's what we do. We just say, put it at coordinates X, Y, Z, and let's see.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And it can be rendered anywhere, which is pretty interesting.
What do you think? Do you think how when we try and look at numbers like pi and a lot of these numbers that seem to break down the nature of reality, and the fact that a lot of them are irrational numbers, do you think that is anyway some sort of almost like the Van Allen belt stopping us from getting to the moon? Like, is that some sort? Do you think? Is there a reason those numbers are irrational? Like, is there? It just seems weird to me that those like basic building blocks of reality seem to be so elusive to us.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I can't say I've specifically thought about irrational numbers, but it seems like we live in what an MIT physicist named Max Tegmark calls a mathematical universe, right? Where everything is based on mathematical principles underneath. And if you think about what a virtual world looks like, it's the same thing. Everything is based on geometry and mathematics. And so, I think the piece missing from the math is that there's a computational element to the physical world. And we're realizing this more and more as we go on. And there's this idea of computational irreducibility, which says that you can't just calculate, step 1005.
Because
you
it's
have
changing.
To actually go through the iterations along the way to get to step 1005, and then you'll know what happens at step 1005. That's why you need a simulation. That's why you need computers. And when you think about irrational numbers, it's almost similar. It's like you can't just compute what the 1 millionth digit is. You have to just
one by one.
Instantly. You have to go through the steps to get there. So I think it's an interesting idea, but somehow these constants are built into the fabric of reality. And there are a number of people who've said that, well, if these numbers in the physical universe were off by just a little bit, including the rate of acceleration and the gravitational constant, that the universe would not support life, right? So it's called the anthropic principle, and people like Lanza with his book Biocentrism talk about this idea. Was the universe set up to be able to create life? And so there's another set of numbers which can't be derived, but somehow they are the fundamental constants of this physical universe. It's almost as if somebody was fiddling with the numbers and then found a set that could simulate what they particularly wanted to simulate. But if we go back to biology and computational irreducibility, there's this idea of fractal algorithms. And if you really want to simulate the physical world, you need these fractal algorithms to show like what leaves and different structures like lightning. Fractals came from a guy, Mandelbrot, who asked back in the 70s, says if you look at the question of how long is a coastline, right? Well, it depends on how you measure it. If you measure it at the level of a satellite in miles, you can say how long it is. But if you go to the curves, it's actually longer. And then you keep going smaller and smaller, and there's more and more curves all the way down to the atomic level. But it depends on what scale. And so fractal algorithms, turns out, are pretty good at simulating the biological world and the physical world. There was a game called No Man's Sky, which came out a few years ago, and it had 8 quintillion planets, each with their own flora and fauna and different trees and different types of life. Now, the guys who made that game, they didn't sit there and come up with 18 quintillion planets. They would still be at it for another 1,000 years. They did what's called procedural generation. They used these fractal algorithms to generate it when it's needed, so when you're there. And so I think that's where this idea of computation and information may lie at the basics of what we call physical reality. And we're realizing that more and more. And I think in another 50 or 100 years, it'll continue to realize that. So even scientists will start to realize that the universe is about information. And then the question comes into play, where is the information stored? Is there somebody looking at the information? Now we get into these bigger metaphysical questions, which are more questions that religion has been asking all along, like what's out there beyond what we can see. And that's why I think, one of the reasons I wrote this book. So I was on, another show, Fade to Black, which you guys may know.
Jimmy Church.
Jimmy goes, I know why you wrote this book, Riz. He goes, it's so you can talk about the same stuff, with a bunch of UFO people on my show, and you can go to MIT and talk about the same stuff. And I said, you're right. That may have been my underlying motivation, is I can talk about this with the science people, and I can talk about it with people in kind of the paranormal world as well, and the traditional religions as well. They get it also.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll get pushback that says, hey, that's not what Jesus Christ said. But the more you look at what the religions are trying to tell us, the more it fits this model better than a material world model ever will.
Do you think that's just by nature of that's where we are? Like, maybe like the ancients didn't have computers, probably. Maybe they did, but I don't think they did. I think they were. Now, how they figured that stuff out, I don't know. I tend to think they're
going out of body all the time.
That's what I tend to think, is a lot of it had to do with entheogens and plant medicines and stuff like that. And
their spiritual practice too. I mean, if we didn't have all these distractions and we were meditating, 10 hours a day, we'd have a different perspective on reality.
That's exactly right. And I don't even think they needed plants. So if you look at the ancient Indian traditions, they studied consciousness quite a bit. And one of the areas that I've studied is, within Tibetan Buddhism, there's this idea of the 6 yogas of Naropa. And one of those yogas is dream yoga. And the idea is that within the dream, you become awake as a lucid dream, and you realize that the dream isn't real, that it is an illusion around you. And then you use that awareness so that when you're awake, quote unquote awake, you realize that the world around you is an illusion as well. So it's like a training method that they use. So clearly they had these ideas already. And turns out, earlier I talked about the 10 stages of technological development, including beaming into the brain, pulling responses out of the brain, false memories, NPCs. Well, it turns out there's already a biological mechanism where all that happens. It's called dreaming, right? It happens every night. We have these little mini simulations that we think we're fully engrossed in a real world. And there's like non-player characters. And some of the people we meet in our dreams might be actual player characters, right? Many of us have experience with precognitive dreams where something happens. Yep. I had an experience. I don't think I've ever talked about this on a radio show, but one morning I had a dream about my uncle, who had passed away years earlier, and I was visiting my parents in Michigan, and I saw my uncle, and I said, Uncle, what are you doing here? You passed away a few years ago, and I never see him in my dreams, right? And so that's what made it unusual. It's what I call a clue in my previous book, Treasure Hunt, because it was unusual. And then I saw him carrying what looked like an Egyptian casket, but kind of this wide person with a weird eye. And then as I woke up, I found out that my parents had just gotten a call that morning from Pakistan, and my uncle's wife was there, and she has this weird thing. She had this weird thing with one of her eyes, and she was kind of a wide-bodied person. And she had just passed away that morning. And so it's almost like he was there, right? And so these types of experiences start to convince us that there's more than material reality going on. So where do the people live who are beyond material reality? That's where the simulation hypothesis, but also the ancients seem to know that. And that's what we were talking about. And so they were able to actually figure things out. And actually, the one thing I wanted to talk about in that realm is I mentioned the 6 yogas of Naropa. Well, it turns out there's a secret 7th yoga. Yeah. And it's one that they didn't teach too widely, but it allowed a yogi to actually take his consciousness out of his physical body and then put it into another entity. So now we're at the point of downloadable consciousness. Yeah. I mean, there's this idea we download when we're born and we upload when we die. So there's already a natural but in this case, there was a famous story of a Tibetan yogi who fell off his horse and he was about to crack his neck and die. He projected his consciousness out into a pigeon that was flying. The pigeon flew to India. He found a recently deceased body. He projected his consciousness from the pigeon to the dead body of this young man, and then he proceeded to teach yoga for the next, I don't know, 50 years. And then later, when another one of his father's disciples wanted somebody to study this yoga, he said, go talk to this guy who they called the pigeon saint in India, because he was the expert, right? And there's many stories like this. That's not the only story, which makes me take it a little more seriously when you start to have multiple cases of this as opposed to somebody just spinning a yarn. But they knew how to download and upload consciousness, which brings us to this interesting ideas. So I think they had figured out, a lot of this. We're now figuring it out, and from a technological point of view. So it's a very different point of view. And it may be a while, though, before that paradigm is really accepted, by science and scientists, because, what we're learning is that there is no objective world. It's really a subjective world, and that's just very difficult to test in a, kind of a lab.
Yeah.
With an objective set of things.
Yeah, although it's malleable. I mean, although we're learning more and more, I think that it's malleable. But it does remind me of, like, we've done a couple episodes on lucid dreaming as well, and there's thousands of people that have had these experiences that you're talking about. We get people emailing all the time with, deep synchronicities or precog dreams, and there's that whole lucid dreaming aspect, which is another part of where the contemporary evidence is going to show us that there is these other dimensions or other realms.
Well, not only that, I just wonder if soul groups and reincarnation and soulmates and things like that were just a different way of explaining, we're using NPC or we're using digital reality, and they just didn't have those terms. Those weren't terms they had. So they came up with, it's almost like we're coming up with the same stuff as they came up with, but we're using a whole new lexicon to describe it.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I mean, as a video game designer, right, we always have this idea of friends in your friends list game, right? And you decide to go on a quest or a raid in World of Warcraft, right, with your guild, and you are sending each other messages saying, hey, at this point in time, we're going to meet at this place inside the virtual world, right? But you're making these plans outside the virtual world. I'm an investor in a company called Discord, which is a really, really popular tool.
We use it all the time.
We use it all the time.
America.ca/chats.
America.ca/chats. Join the conversation. Don't be a dick.
There you go. So where Discord came from, it was actually a game company initially. They were making a video game and a mobile game. It didn't work out, but they had created this cool chat thing, and they said they were using it to talk to each other. And so then players of video games started to use the app to talk to each other. So it was a gamer chat initially. Now it's used for many things. It's used for cryptocurrency. It's used for lots of things. But that reminded me a lot of Journey of Souls, if you guys have ever read that book by Dr. Michael Newton, he did hypnotic regression of his patients back to birth, and then he started finding out what happened in between one life and the next. And they started to tell stories of how they would plan out with other individuals whom we might call soul groups, or in video games we would call our guild or our friends, specific encounters that they might have. Like, you're supposed to meet, your soulmate, at this point in your life, and she's going to have a certain necklace, and you're just going to be drawn to it. And there's something funny about that, as a deja vu. And so I think this idea of soul groups fits really well. And they didn't have this digital narrative, and we're coming up with it because of video games more than anything. But it's the same kind of concepts, and they apply equally well, I think, to both of these areas.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I used to have, when we used to talk about simulation hypothesis, I used to feel like it was more of a materialistic way to look at the reality, but I'm glad that you approached the consciousness part of it, because it finally clicked for me that how consciousness not being part of the brain would fit into the simulation hypothesis. So I finally just kind of leveled up in my understanding about that part of it. And then what else was I going to say about that? Where was I going with that? Do you have anything?
Well, I come down to two. There's the way I look at it, we're down to two possibilities, and they actually boil down to one possibility. Unless, I think there's a little bit of wiggle room with electric universe theory, because, I don't really have a good enough understanding of unified field theory yet to say for sure, but I think the nature of electricity and fields like that could maybe cause some of these constants that we seem to see in like,
Hmm.
I mean, like just the little thing around the sun and the earth where, you know, the radius of the moon is 1,080 miles. And, you know, if you take the diameter of the moon and times it by 108, you get to over 97% accuracy, the distance from the moon to the earth. And now if you take the sun and you take its diameter and you times it by 108, you get 99.5 accuracy, the distance from the earth to the sun. Venus is 108 million miles from the sun. And you've got this coincidence that the earth and the moon, you know, or sorry, the sun and the moon are the exact same size in the sky. You know, one's 400 times farther away, but this one's 400 times smaller. So that makes up for all that. So it works out perfectly.
Yeah, it almost seems like you know, an algorithmic thing.
Yeah.
Where, you know, certain
These are the
planets
laws for life.
are built that way so that it would be X times Y. And so you see like this interesting mathematical relation. Now we don't know, we're finding evidence of lots of exoplanets, and we don't know, you know, what the moons are on those planets because they're so far away. But it's possible that, you know, if this is a simulated world, that there are rules that they're following as well. I mean, we are realizing that they're very common, that there's just this, there's probably, you know, most stars may end up having some planets, which even 20 years ago was not acknowledged. Even 10 years ago, they were just starting to acknowledge that. But now there's, you know, something like in the order of, I don't know, like 1 trillion planets that they think is the latest estimate.
Yeah.
You know, given 100 billion stars in our galaxy and 100 billion galaxies out there, you get to, but you know, there could be very much these types of rules that are embedded into the physical world. Now, there's a physicist who's a string theorist named Jim Gates. I think he's at University of Maryland, and he says that he found within the equations of string theory, he found error correction codes. Right? I said, why the heck do we have error correction codes inside physical reality? Well, look, as a computer scientist, we work with error correction codes all the time. They're needed because whenever we have to compress information down, we have to transmit information, right? And so the reason that you can watch, you know, Game of Thrones on your iPad is because we're not sending all the pixels. It would be too many pixels if you look at every single frame to send over a wireless device to your iPad. And so we have to compress those pixels down. And then when it gets to your computer, we have to decompress those pixels and display them. But to make sure we got it right, that's what error correction codes are for. And it was a concept that was introduced by Claude Shannon, who used to be at MIT back in the 1950s in Bell Labs.
Bell Labs, yeah.
Was that the error correction codes are needed for transmission of information and compression of information. And now, you know, two of the biggest mysteries in quantum physics are, why is there this thing called quantum indeterminacy, which if we have time we can talk about. And the second one is, why is there this thing called quantum entanglement? Right, which Einstein called spooky action at a distance. Right? It was this idea that two particles, once they're entangled, it's like they have the same value. And even if this one goes 1 million miles away and this one's here, they have a similar value, so you can figure out the other value from this value. And so, you know, when I look at it as a computer scientist, I say, well, that's probably a compression technique, right? In Game of Thrones, you could say all of the white pixels in the winter scenes.
That's
right,
why there's fractals.
They're all compressed down. There's right fractal algorithms and there's compression. So they have the same value. It's an optimization technique. And that's why you need error codes in the universe. So it's starting to tie together, even though, you know, most mainstream scientists still aren't there yet. But I think over time, you know, this idea, of course, the computation and the computers that they use are very different from our computers, right? But computation exists independently of silicon. It's similar to how we say there's no shared rendered universe in a video game. So like if you and I are both playing World of Warcraft, it's our computer, our laptop, that's actually rendering the scene. So we could be rendering slightly different versions. We don't know. The only shared thing in between those two is information. Right?
Only when you interact.
Yeah, or even when you interact, who are you interacting with?
Yeah.
The avatar of the other person, right? Which is rendered on your screen. Now, in video games, the screen is an iPhone or a laptop, but in this physical universe, it could be our consciousness, right? Our consciousness is needed to render And this brings up the idea that we may all be rendering slightly different versions.
Right.
So do you think that
of work.
do you think that it's a rendered reality, or do you think that we're all sort of co-creating it?
Well, I think that we are all influencing the rendering, which is kind of like co-creating, if you will, right? That we are all observing something slightly different, but we can influence the direction that it takes. So there was a really famous experiment in physics by a Nobel Prize winning physicist named Eugene Wigner. And he proposed an experiment that said, hey, if Wigner in Germany or wherever he was looks at a set of particles and he observes a particular collapse of the wave, meaning the particles are this way, but he doesn't tell his friend, and Wigner's friend looks at the same particles before he knows what Wigner saw, will he see something different, a different configuration of those particles? And this was an experiment they couldn't do back in the 60s. Well, it turns out just recently, I think in England, they did that experiment with like 5 entangled particles, and they found that it was possible that Wigner and Wigner's friend saw a different configuration of those same 5 entangled particles. Now that's weird. That means that there is actually no physical reality that's shared, that's objective. Because if 2 people can look at particles and see a different perspective, it means somehow the consciousness is influencing that what they call the collapse of the probability wave to a single physical reality. And so it's possible we are all rendering on our own consciousness, and then we are making choices.
Could that just be like a dropped frame that we're okay with, though?
Could it be a dropped frame?
Like those differences in rendering are just like, because it's kind of like, where it's just like, fuck it, nobody will notice.
Right. Well, in video games, we have to do this a little bit where we have to synchronize multiple players who are sitting on their own computers.
Yeah.
And if this guy swings his axe at the other guy's character first, and the other guy swings his sword, we have to figure out who did what when. But it's impossible to do because there's no such thing as simultaneity. So we end up having to drop things and kind of make inferences. And so it's possible that we're all influencing this collective reality and that we're having to drop various pieces of it in order to create what seems like a shared objective reality. And, this is something the mystics have been telling us all along, right? I mean, the Buddha said, know all things to be like this, a mirage or a dream or a cloud image, like a cloud, right? And so this thing that we think of as physical is only there because we're all observing it together. And Castaneda talked a lot about this back in the 70s. Now, some people say he was just on a drug trip, right? But, the idea was that the physical universe is only a consensus reality, he called it, right? Which now physics may be getting to that point of saying it's a consensus reality. And this is something we do in computer science, is we have to come up with a consensus between all the different players of what actually happened so that we can then transmit that information back to everybody. So it's a very interesting aspect of existence in the physical universe. Yeah.
And that gets back to your
I was going to get to that.
Reality, because this is how
that's
it's
something
malleable.
else the mystics have been telling us for a long time, is that you can subtly influence it. And I think that even the Bible, to a certain extent, is trying to tell us that. It's been a little bit co-opted and maybe a little bit shifted around so that it, maybe faith is a little misplaced and things like that. I'm not going to comment on that. But there seems to be these people that have said that, manifestation and the secret and all that sort of stuff. And a couple examples of that are like, the fastball, like 20 years ago it was impossible to throw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Now it's like everyone's doing it. If you don't have a couple pitchers on your team that can throw a 100-mile fastball, you're behind the times. And something tells me in 10 years it's going to be 105. And in 10 years after that, it's going to be 110.
And it's not just from technological breakthroughs.
It's throwing a fucking ball. I don't think we're exercising different. I think we've naturally evolved to throw things like rocks at prey and stuff like that. Another thing's the 4-minute mile that no one seemed to be able to do forever, and that's another thing. We're getting faster and faster at running, and I wonder if it isn't
inventions, simultaneous
hundreds monkey things and stuff like that. And I just wonder if it isn't that. That this guy decides I'm going to throw a ball faster than this guy, and he just believes it with every fucking ounce of his being, until he throws a ball faster. But I mean, that's kind of a mundane explanation for, I mean, I was just listening to Scott Adams' Periscope the other day where he starts talking about, you know, how affirmations and everything that are actually, he's taken it to the next level where he says this is a simulation. And you can,
right. He's a big proponent of the simulation.
Yeah, and he's like, listen, I'm telling you right now, I made my life by influencing the simulation. You can hack it with little techniques, and you systems. Can actually affect reality. And
right.
the reason
that when he was a kid, he thought he could become a famous cartoonist. Right?
Yeah. Well, not only that, he's cured himself from incurable diseases.
Oh wow!
Like he had.
I don't know if it's a disease. It's a
well,
condition.
It was a condition. Vocal. I can't remember what it's called, but it was
dysphonia.
Dysphonia.
Something dysphonia.
And I mean, he's like he has example after example of things he's beaten with affirmations, which are things I've seen work in my own life to a certain degree. And the thing that really struck me is he started talking about some of these authors, and this is kind of a rabbit hole I've been going on down independently for the last 6 or 8 months, and it's, you know, these books like Think and Grow Rich and Napoleon Hill and things like of that nature. Norman Vincent Peale, Power of Positive Thinking, I think it's called, or whatever it is. And I mean, these are guys that are straight up thinking that guy actually used to be Donald Trump's pastor.
Right.
But anyway, there's these guys that are saying now, before it was manifestation. Now, I think Scott Adams is the first person I've heard take that manifestation to the simulation level. But him doing that, just, I don't know, for some reason, it instantly started to make a lot of sense to me, because those are two things that I'm extremely interested in, and that I'm, you know, the simulation theory and having some sort of subtle control of reality, and the way you explain how there's two different realities. So it's like, you know, I can't change when you swing your sword, maybe, but maybe I can subtly change other little things that maybe only really affect my reality and maybe only subtly affect yours in ways that are undetectable. So it's okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the law of attraction is interesting. And it's within the simulation context, it makes a little more sense because, you know, if you've ever played a game like Minecraft or Second Life, you can create physical objects, right? And you can change your character. And you're making those decisions with your consciousness, which exists outside of the simulation, right? And you can say, well, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Now, I think in our simulation, it's not quite so easy because, I mean, the thing with manifestation and affirmations is they seem to work sometimes, but you can't say they work 100% of the time either, right? And so this is where I think we have a combination of free will, where we're like in a video game, we can make choices, but we also have a set of quests and achievements that our character is kind of has planned out. We're free to choose to do those or not do those along the way. You know, like I don't think affirmations are going to turn me into, you know, 7-foot basketball player as much as I'd like to. There are certain choices that we make to our characters, and I'm a computer geek, and, you know, I'm not really that good at athletics, right? So, but, you know, there are things that I feel like I was meant to do and that are very easy, whether it's writing or computer programming, and the things that you know, are really easy for me. And so I think, you know, manifestation may be also a matter of choosing amongst these different paths that are available to us. And in quantum physics, they talk about this idea of parallel worlds, which is another interpretation of, you know, this idea of superposition, which is like Schrodinger's cat is either dead or alive. Well, it turns out Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive until somebody is there to observe it. And so there might be these different possibilities. You are cured of a disease, you are not cured of a disease. You become a famous cartoonist, you don't become a famous cartoonist. And somehow this process of manifestation and affirmations makes you consciously choose and view what we call the collapse of the probability wave to that. It's like you're navigating your personal universe to the world where you are X versus Y. But it somehow has to fit in with everybody else's X or Y, otherwise we won't be in a consensus reality anymore. It'll start to fracture. Now you get into things like the Mandela effect and other things like that.
I was gonna ask you about that, if you bumped into that along all this research, but I also wanted to mention...
And you do start to affect other realities subtly. Like, I mean, if Scott Adams did manifest his, you know, his fortune, I mean, that means anyone else who's benefited from his path along the way,
right,
has had their reality affected.
There's indirect
and I mean, I mean, that cascades out into everyone's affecting it, you know, negatively or positively on some level. You know, if you're just watching TV all night and crushing Pepsis and pizza, then, and what, you know, whatever it is, you
Yeah.
know, you're an NPC.
Yeah, or it's kind of like American Idol. Everybody's voting on it, right? But
Yeah, like
it's
subtly
voting
upvoting
in different
experiences. Yeah.
subtly, right? I mean, one of the areas you talked about earlier was synchronicity, and you know, I think the interesting thing about synchronicity is you have something in your mind that matches something in the outside world, right? So that's a meaningful coincidence. And I've always wondered about this term meaningful. And you know, my last book, Treasure Hunt, was all about how these synchronicities and deja vu experiences are like clues on our own personal treasure hunt. We're like Indiana Jones, and we're out there trying to find some treasure. Of course, you know, if Indiana Jones were just to get the map at the beginning of beginning of the movie and say, "Here's the X, go get the treasure," that wouldn't make for a very interesting movie, right? He has to like follow one clue, and that has to take him to the next clue, and eventually he gets there. And our lives are kind of like that, where we're getting these subtle clues about things that are some of the probabilities or possibilities that we might pursue, but it's still up to us to kind of go after them. So I was talking with Jacques Vallée, you know, who was involved with Project Blue Book back in the day and has studied this, and he's a computer scientist. He worked with NASA, you know, back in the day, and with the ARPANET. And he was saying he thinks the reason synchronicity exists is because in a computer, when you store information, you retrieve it based on associations, right? So you store like an index that says, you know, this particular object is related to that particular object. And that's how you organize it. You don't necessarily organize everything alphabetically. You just have a bunch of information and you have an index to get there. And maybe the structure of our world is such that when you're thinking about something, that is like a retrieval operation, right? It actually ends up retrieving an event or an object that's related to that. And so that's the case where synchronicity and the law of attraction may actually have a similar underlying origin in the structure of the universe and how it stores events. Getting back to our idea of the Akashic records, I mean, you're talking about a huge number of records and things. How would you ever pull those? Well, you can think about something and it automatically pulls it.
It
so by
resonates with it. Yeah, yeah.
And there's so much information that we haven't even thought about accessing yet.
Right. How do you access that much information? Well, you think about a person or a situation and it comes up. But again, I'm a computer scientist, so I would say, how does that work? So it's almost like meaningfulness is like an axis. And you can use, just like we think of, you know, an alphabet. I can say, use the letter M and look at the index and find, you know, or G and look at the Grimerica show and find out where it's stored on the server, right? Similarly, it's like a situation or an event and consciousness. You know, what is that fundamental element of consciousness?
Yeah,
it's very hard to say, but it's thinking about something.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we talked about with the Resonance. We had a couple people on from the Resonance Academy, like that Nassim Harriman's work, and it really started to click with me that when you have a thought, it is an electrical, and it's a shape. Those protons are in those shapes, and it's going to resonate with something somewhere else, and that's kind of how that law of attraction thing works. Is you're connecting through entanglement, through that resonance.
Yeah, well, it was all entangled at one time.
Yep, that's right. I think resonance, you know, is a good explanation for that, but we still don't know exactly what that means, right? Like okay, resonance, how? Depends on the kind of waves that we're talking about, right?
Grimerica.ca/episode 241 for anyone who wants to go back and check out our Jacques Vallée interview.
Oh yeah,
it was 2 years ago already.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Man, time flies.
Yeah, and you know, Jacques has been around longer than most of us and has studied so many different phenomenon, but he's coming at it from a scientific point of view, and that's why, you know, I really like talking to him about this. There was an interesting synchronicity that happened with him that you guys might get a kick out of. So before my book was published, which was on the 20th anniversary of The Matrix, it was like March 31st. So about a month before that, you know, he had read the book and he had given me a nice endorsement.
Nice.
He was in Big Sur, and he was showing a slide about the simulation hypothesis and about my book, and I didn't even know this because I wasn't there. And so he was giving this presentation, and they all decided to break for lunch. And they went to the cafeteria, and he was talking about the Matrix and the simulation. And who was in the cafeteria but Lawrence Fishburne, who played Morpheus, you know, in the Matrix. And so that was a nice little synchronicity story that I heard about it from somebody else, and then Jacques told me about it later as well. So it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, the thing that slipped my mind there, you kind of addressed it anyways, but it was that it was what makes us think about a synchro or a simulation over the last few years is these stories that we hear of deep synchronicities or numerical coincidences that are so deep that they can't just be human. They can't just be somebody making this stuff up. You know how we have those things with dates and birthdays.
Oh, the processional. It's like this weird sort of the processional numbers, like 72, and there's the breakdown of all the numbers that are processional numbers with the procession of the equinoxes.
That too, but even with dates and times and
yeah,
all that.
Yeah, but even the processional numbers that seem to be baked into our fundamental reality. I mean, we were talking a couple shows ago about, so if you go to another system that's experiencing a different procession, does it have different ground rules for reality? It's like literally a different dimension. So every solar system is a different dimension.
Yeah, we in video games we refer to physics engines, and every video game may have a different set of rules, right? And some you can fly, and some things are built a certain way, getting to the 3D models and the mathematical constants. But I did want to come back to something we mentioned earlier, which was the Mandela effect.
Yeah,
and this idea of alternate timelines. And so one of the people that I met with when doing research for the book was the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. His wife Tessa, and his work is more popular now than ever. And with Blade Runner, he had this idea of androids and AI with false memories, and with The Man in the High Castle, which is now a very popular show on Amazon, he showed us this alternate reality, which is based on his book from the '60s, where Germany and Japan won World War II. So what Tessa told me was that he actually believed that reality really happened, that the Axis powers won the war and divided up America amongst them. And he remembered those memories, but then he encountered some beings that he says they were fiddling with the timeline. And they didn't like where that timeline ended up, so they rewound it. And we ended up in a timeline where the Allies won World War II. There's big events like this, but he also came up with the idea with little things that would change. And his story, The Adjustment Team, which was made into a movie with Matt Damon and Emily Blunt, The Adjustment Bureau, was all about, they would freeze. There's a team of people. Who are they? Didn't say. They would freeze a certain office building, and they would change everybody's memories, and they would change something about the world and adjust it. And then this guy got a peek behind the curtain, the main character in the story. In the movie, it was a little bit different, but he also got a peek behind the curtain. And he wasn't supposed to see that. But he saw how things were changed, and so Philip K. Dick, he actually believed this is actually a computer-generated reality. And sometimes when we experience feelings of deja vu, or something is weird, or memories that don't quite seem right, that's because we actually experienced that in another timeline, and that it was adjusted by those who are overseeing the simulation. Now, who are those? His wife said he believed. Are they aliens? Are they future humans? He believed they were actually future beings from this planet who looked like aliens, but who actually were going back and changing the timeline to change their own future. Which is another interesting theory.
Yeah, well, Mandela, there's that deep Mandela effect.
Grimerica.ca/EP256 for a chat with Tessa Dick.
Yeah, Tessa was good too. Yeah. So there's those Mandelas. I mean, Danny from Clouded Games was on talking about the Mandela, how people are seeing the adjustment happen in the Mandela as well, which I can't quite wrap my head around. But that's interesting that it's not just a different memory from past, but they're actually noticing that, then coming back to it in the contemporary time and seeing it flip. I think they call it a Mandela flip, I think, yeah. Are
they remembering both, or are they actually seeing it?
I don't know. I wondered if you had any more information on that.
I hadn't heard of the Mandela flip, but certainly heard of the effect where, some of those things, you talk with scientists, and I spend time a lot with scientists, and I spend time with people that are, in kind of these other worlds. And, some of those things are like the Bernstein Bears being spelled, BEREN versus BERN. They seem like honest mistakes, but some of these bigger things, seem like they can't be explained away. And, it'd be interesting to see if there are people who have memories of both. like Philip K. Dick had memories of both
Yeah.
the Man in the High Castle timeline and our timeline.
Yeah.
Are there people who have memories of Nelson Mandela in both of those timelines? And I think that could be an interesting study, and could give some interesting scientific facts, behind this effect.
Hey,
I'm still not sure who won.
That's
the war.
what I was just gonna say. For some of us, the perception with Project Paperclip and all the Nazi scientists going to Russia and the States, maybe we did. Maybe they did.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, people tie the origins of the CIA and all of the secrecy we have in our government to
Shit got
all these
greasy.
Nazis.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah, and then there was the guy, I forget his name, but he had a very elaborate story of how the Nazis actually won World War II, but they let us think we won. And so there was
There's stuff to that too. That's Farrell, isn't it? Joseph P. Farrell.
I don't remember. It might be that.
I'll tell you what. If you read our buddy Carl Joseph DeMarco's novel,
okay,
that is a great little twist on the Nazis winning the war, and it's got like 9/11 baked in there, and then the Iraq War, and it's fantastic. There's shamanism flying around.
Shamanism too. Well, I gotta check that out.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, I'll email you the link. When you email me that info we were talking about earlier, I'll reply with Carl's book.
Yep,
it's a good one. It's a good one. So we're up over an hour.
Yeah.
Did you want to? We had said we might get back to the. I think it's a fancy way of saying the observer effect.
Right. Yeah. So we can talk a little bit about that before we wrap up. And so in quantum physics, this idea of superposition, which is used in quantum bits as well, where you can have multiple possibilities or probabilities, all came from the double slit experiment, which is this idea that if you shoot particles through slits A and B, if it's a wave, it'll show up as an interference pattern on the opposite side. But if it's a particle, each particle has to go through one or the other of the slits. They can't go through both. And they found that it wasn't until someone actually observed the particle that it seemed to make a decision about going from a wave to a specific particle. Another way to think about it is you're in a movie theater and you got to sit in one of the seats. But when the lights are dark, there's a certain probability that you're in each one of the seats. But then if you shine a light on a specific seat, that's when you figure out if you're actually in that seat or not. And so, this is one of the big mysteries in quantum physics is how does this work, right? And that's what they call the collapse of the probability wave. And I think an even bigger question is, why does it work that way, right? And in some cases, they have an experiment that they call the delayed choice experiment, where the particles go through one slit or the other, and then it makes another choice down the road. And they found that even if that particle goes 1,000 miles to a satellite, that it's not until it's observed that it decides whether it went through slit A or B. Now that's in the future. So the future is influencing the past, right? And every version of the delayed choice experiment that's been done, has actually confirmed that result. And again, so people are scratching their heads. And I think it was, Niels Bohr who said, if you're not amazed by quantum physics, then you haven't really understood it. And Feynman himself, said that, if you think you understand it, you really don't, because it's so bizarre. Now, looking at this from the video game perspective, it actually makes more sense. If you remember earlier, I said that they could not render a fully 3D world like World of Warcraft in the 1980s, on a Commodore 64 computer. They didn't have enough processing power to have a fully rendered world and take all those pixels. Well, it turns out the optimization technique that was built was rendered only that which is observed, right? So if you can't see behind a wall, you don't have to render those pixels. So only if there's a conscious observer in video games is it rendered onto your local computer. And that's why we're able to do MMORPGs with 3D worlds like League of Legends or World of Warcraft. So that's the same rule in quantum physics, which is render only that which is observed. And that's why I like this term rendered world rather than physical world, especially now that there's evidence that we may be rendering slightly different versions of it. And so, quantum indeterminacy doesn't make sense. And it turns out if you view it from the lens of the simulation hypothesis, it makes a little more sense because it's all about optimization. Yeah. And that's how this entire, very gigantic world, right? That's 15 billion light years, beyond may actually be rendered is through a set of rules like this. And it may actually explain the very small and the very big, which is something that physics has not been able to come up with explanations for.
Well, the idea of fractals is interesting to think about it as a compression tool. I mean,
right, because algorithmically, you don't need to store all those pixels.
That's right. We just need to create a smaller vision of it that we can expand later.
Yep, exactly. And that gets to the computation.
So maybe the Big Bang was just the first, like...
Could be a first step of the computation of an algorithm, like whether it's a fractal algorithm or another algorithm. If you look at the biological world, it works through, like if you're going to clone a person or an organism, it doesn't happen at once. You don't start with the pig and get a fully grown pig, right? You have to go through the process of the cells
of growing and dividing the
cells. DNA is the information, or a tree, right? It just doesn't spark up over, a leaf doesn't spark up, in an instant. It happens over time. And that's because of these algorithms. That's where there's evidence of computation in nature. Some people say the simulation hypothesis in the scientific world, they don't like it because it's unfalsifiable. And by that, they mean you can't prove that it's false. And I said, well, that doesn't mean that you can't show there's evidence that it's true, right? Just because you can't prove it's false. It's like with meteorites, there were many reports of rocks coming from the sky, and scientists didn't believe them back in the 1700s and 1800s. You couldn't prove that that was not true, but you could find some evidence that it was true, and they eventually did. And now it's accepted. And so I think that's some of these things, fractal algorithms, error correction codes, quantum indeterminacy, the delayed choice experiment, quantum entanglement, Wigner and Wigner's friends. All of these are pointing us, to and quantum qubits are evidence of information and computation being the structure of our physical world, which leads us to believe that it's not a physical world, which means it could be very much a simulated world when you think of that. And so that's how I would kind of wrap up.
That's a great example. Yeah.
I mean, that 108 gets you the 108 moon distances and sun distances. And Brad just texted me some more info there. It's a
sacred number too.
He's like, Earth diameter times 108 is the sun diameter. And it's also a sacred number. 108's long been considered a sacred number in Hinduism and yoga. According to yogic tradition, there are 108 pithas, or sacred sites throughout India.
In Buddhism, too.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
There's 108 marma points, 108 sacred places of the body, 108 chakras.
Yeah. Well, in computer science, we have this idea of seed numbers that are used to do things like generate random numbers. Like computers can't really generate random numbers. So the programmers have to put in certain seeds, as they call it, and then those are used to generate everything else. So it's very possible that as we uncover some of these numbers and we see them again and again, whether it's pi or it's this type of number, that these are seed numbers that are being fed into our physical algorithms that generate the physical world around us. And somehow these guys have figured out what those numbers are, just like they were able to figure out downloadable consciousness.
And the seed of life is sacred geometry.
There you go. That may be what sacred geometry is. Yeah, the seed of life, but also the seed of the physical world.
Yeah.
Jeez. Right. Well, I think that was fantastic.
Well, before we go, we got to get you to talk about your the Bitmovio, or what was the thing you were talking about?
Yeah. So Bitmovio, which is bitmov.io, bitmove.io, is a new website. It's like a YouTube, but it's for the paranormal community, and then we have sci-fi and horror, so we have certain genres that we're focused on. But more and more we're seeing censorship on places like YouTube, particularly for some of this edgy content. And you're seeing channels being demonetized, and you're seeing lots of censorship on Facebook, elsewhere. And so it's kind of a combination of YouTube with Netflix, with a Patreon where you can support your favorite content creators. And the whole thing is gamified, so it's a freemium model. I come out of the gaming world. And the idea is you can have virtual currency, you can watch videos and earn points, and then you can use those points to pay for movies, but also to tip and gift your favorite content creators. And so we got a lot of folks, from the UFO paranormal world who have already set up channels on there. And so we'd love to see America on there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's fantastic. We're waiting for something like that. I mean, are you gonna accept Libra when it comes around?
Yeah, so there's a cryptocurrency
No, I
element.
hope not.
Just
I
send
hope
your
not.
cash.
No
Libra.
Libra.
Well, not necessarily
No,
Libra,
no, I'm
but
just kidding.
there's a cryptocurrency, element to it,
Yeah.
which means you can have a distributed currency.
Yeah.
Even now, you can pay with Ether, so you can get around, having to pay using credit cards, etc.
Oh, that's
So that's
great.
built
Yeah.
into the site already.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we've been talking about a way to just micropayment or tip shows and tip things that instead of going through the traditional, what else is happening is PayPal and these problems with Patreon as well. So at least that gives people another way to support their favorite content without going through the
I can't be trusted with
system.
cryptocurrency.
I know.
I've lost it all.
You've
Actually,
lost it
the
all?
new cryptocurrency is safe because I've forgotten the password. So Jordan,
really?
buddy,
No.
could use
That
a help
reminds me of the Big Bang Theory episode where they had mined a bunch of Bitcoin and they were trying to find that laptop from a couple of years ago.
Oh, I'm gonna end up when Bitcoin's. If McAfee's right, I don't know if he's right or not, but he says Bitcoin's going to 1 million. So I'm gonna end up having sent some fella $500,000.
Wow, that's
Well,
like the
it was
guy
only
who
110 at the
pizza.
time.
7 million.
It was only 100. It was only 110 at the time.
That's about when I started buying Bitcoin. I used to go to downtown Mountain View and pull out $100 from Bank of America and give it to somebody, and they would give me 1 Bitcoin
Oh, that's awesome.
on my phone. So that was back in 2013. But it's been through a lot of ups and downs since then.
I try not to think about it anymore. I emailed
Remember
Buddy. I
the
was like,
password.
well, I sent it to the wrong address, and I emailed Buddy, and I was like, dude, I accidentally sent you those Bitcoins, and he's like, no, you didn't. So then I sent him a screenshot of it, and then he just blocked me.
I had the same problem with PayPal, where some guy that I had paid for Bitcoin claimed I never paid. That he had paid me for the Bitcoin. He got PayPal to basically take back his money, but I had already sent him the Bitcoin, and so basically I got screwed from those couple of Bitcoin that I had sold him at that point in time. So there is some issues with
Some
that
Bitcoin fuckery. But it's all your own fault. That's the thing, right? That's what McCowie said.
Right.
Well, he's like, you got to be able to you got to be able to handle your own shit. He's like, that's the thing about freedom. He's like, you're responsible
but
for
now
yourself.
There are ways to have cryptocurrency without having to necessarily have all the private keys and remember everything. And that's, within Telegram or Discord.
Mm-hmm.
There's another company, I'm an investor in them, so full disclosure, called Button Wallet. And within Telegram, you can send cryptocurrency from one guy to another by using their username. And same with Discord. Eventually, they're going to be able to do that as well.
Oh, nice.
Oh, we could use that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that we think it'll get better, so it's not so hard for people to use eventually. And with Bitmovio, that's the idea, is that we're sort of against censorship and too much centralized control. And so we wanted a cryptocurrency way to do micropayments. But you can also still just use your credit card, which is what most people are using now.
Yeah.
But you can buy the movie bits and you can pay a content creator, you give them like 49 cents. Or you can buy a virtual gift, which is worth $10. You can use that to tip your favorite creators and support your channel.
Awesome. That's
so.
fantastic.
Did you say you're part of Discord as well?
Yep.
I was an early investor in Discord. I know the founder, Jason Citron, back when he was just a game company. So we invested.
I'm a Nitro member. So,
there you go.
Yeah. So just tell your buddies there to let the Gry America server be. We're good people. There's some sketchy shit in there once in a while, but overall, we're pretty well behaved.
There you go. So when
Anyway.
I talk to him, I'll see if I can mention that.
Perfect. I mean, we got an in at Zoom now too. Shameless is working at Zoom, so
right
he's
on.
working on comping our account.
Nice.
So
Any other
America's
links?
infiltrating.
Any other links we should
The
put in the show
simulation.
notes or anything like that for your? I'll put your website in there.
Twitter. Put his Twitter.
Yeah. So my website is zenentrepreneur.com. And people can learn more about the book there, or they can get it on Amazon or at their local bookstore. I'm a big supporter of local bookstores, so go to your local Barnes and Noble and you can order it there as well.
Nice. Right on.
Well, if you want to join the chats, Riz, it's grimerica.ca/chats. We'd love to have you. We'll give you a special color and everything.
Sure.
And come back anytime. Honestly, this has been a blast.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thanks so much.
A lot of fun. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to being on again sometime.
All right.
Awesome.
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. And that was our chat with Rizwan's Virk. What'd you think, buddy?
It was great. Yeah. It's one of my favorites. No, sometimes
one
when
of
you
my
read a book-
favorites, Dunlop.
Sometimes when you read a book, it's hard to know what the conversation is going to be like. You know, the book's all laid out, but this was very entertaining and interesting. More stuff kind of clicked with me, and yeah, it was good.
I can tell when stuff's clicking.
Good.
I can see it click. I can almost hear it sometimes.
I want to get him to try my sister's VR game.
Oh, I'm sure it's a possibility.
Yeah,
Something tells me that
yeah, that'd be good because it's really immersive.
the beauty about Great America is we just end up being friends with all our guests. So I'm sure we'll be able to.
There we go.
We'll join his platform. We'll get him to check out your sister's
we
game.
gotta check that out.
And we'll have him on the show again. That was fantastic. I wasn't sure what to expect with the MIT. You never really know. I didn't read the book, so I go into these things blind. But fuck, some people you just have a great time with.
Oh yeah,
great conversation.
I forgot or I didn't realize how much he was into the stuff we are too. All the guests he talked about that we've had on, and UFOs and NDEs and paranormal. That's fantastic.
The chats loved it. We got $30-$40 in super chats.
All right.
The YouTube subscriptions are good to go for another couple months, buddy. Seriously though, super chats do help. It helps us. It gives us incentive for going live because we really don't have one. It's just a lot more pressure, a lot more work.
Plus, we don't. Really
we know you guys are watching us. We don't want to be live, but then we see a super chat comes through and it cheers us up and it makes it kind of worth it. So you hit the super chat. That helps with the live thing. Of course, grimerica.ca/support, which helps us keep uncensored and makes us unaffected by YouTube demonetizations and things like that. So as long as you guys continue to pay us, which at least 1 out of 100 of you do, we're trying to get that number up to 2 out of 100.
Is at least, did it break the 1%?
I think we're at about 1% right
good.
now. If I add up all the platforms, we're closing in on 1%.
Nice.
I think we've got, we usually don't, we're closing in on almost 500 supporters.
That's good.
Which I think across the board is probably around 1%.
Yeah, that's good.
So there you go. Let's go for 2. Let's go for 2%. We've done the thing of we've doubled our value. Now we're asking you guys to double your value. grimerica.ca/support. I'll tell you what. Sign up we're trying to get to 200 Patreons by the end of July, but if you want to do PayPal or something like that instead, I'll count those two. We just want more support. We want.
Why did you make a Patreon to begin with?
Because it was easier to count.
Full disclosure.
Because it gives you an actual number.
Easier tracking.
Yeah. But PayPal actually takes a less percentage. But we're just going for more supporters. So honestly, we're trying this thing out. We're seeing if the extra work can get, a few of the 99 out of 100 of you that won't support the show to say, hey, I will support the show for a couple bucks a month. And if enough of you do that, then we'll feel a little more appreciated. And it's like it worth our time to spend twice as much time in the studio recording content because it's fun. We don't mind doing it. It is a lot of work. It takes us out of our family lives and everything else, and we're trying to take this thing to the next level. And we honestly we can't do that without support. We're kind of teetering between two worlds here. So grimerica.ca/support. Help us dip into one dimension. Anything else?
That's it.
That's it. All right, guys. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week. Live people are still there.
Thanks for joining us. That would have been fun live. He's a great speaker, eh? How articulate he was. I didn't expect it to be that awesome, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it was a good one. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Don't put that over my head.
It was a good chat. Like I say, I wasn't sure what to expect with Riz, but he can come back anytime. Fun chat. Always having fun in the lives, get people laughing. Got a bunch of people in the live chat again. Thanks for coming, guys. Tell your friends. I guess we'll be back in probably like half an hour.
Oh, half an hour for what? Intros and stuff?
Might as well do 2 intros.
Well, we'll see. I don't know exactly what time it'll be, but soon.
We got about
and then
3 hours to kill.
We'll be on Lighting the Void tonight at 10
p.m. So 3 hours from now. I wonder, are we going to live stream that?
Maybe we should.
Yeah. So we'll probably be live till like fucking for another 5 hours, but we're going to take like a half an hour break. So hit the bell so you get the alert, because we'll be back sometimes between a half an hour and an hour. We're going to take some time and do a little business meeting of sorts. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in live.